This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. I have long argued that you can't really understand defense without also understanding economics. And that you can't really understand economics unless you understand politics. You can't really understand politics, unless you understand finance. You can't understand finance unless you understand defense, as each one of these four bounces off of one another. And to give an example of what I'm talking about here, I know this may sound absolutely horrible to some of you, but I want you to imagine yourself as Vladimir Putin. I know, but stick with me on this one. So, it's 11 a.m., you've been watching RT, and your favorite commentator on television tells you that the war in Ukraine is on the brink of victory, and just one more push should win it. Which to you, as Vladimir Putin, probably sounds great. So you stop what you're doing, turn off the television, and call a meeting of the Security Council of Russia, the highest defense and security body in the country. So a few hours later, you head downstairs in the Kremlin to figure out how many extra soldiers you're going to need to finally win the war. Now, once you enter the Security Council meeting, there'll usually be around 14 to 20 people in there. But for this particular meeting about conscription, you really only need to worry about 4 of them. Those 4 being Gerasimov, Belousov, Volodin, and Selyanov. Now, starting on your left, you turn to Gerasimov first. Now, Gerasimov is the chief of the general staff and the head honcho for the war in Ukraine. And he has a whole bunch of vacancies to fill within the Russian army. So he turns to you and says, "To win this war, Mr. President, we need to draft 1 million extra men," promising you that with that many men, you'll easily win the war and break the Ukrainian lines. And whilst I'm sure a lot of you listening would assume that, he's the general in the room, he's the head of the Russian military, that must be the solution to the problem, you're quickly going to find the other 3 advisors may not agree with him. So you turn to your second advisor, the man sitting next up the table, Belousov, the Minister of Defense. Now, Belousov, while not planning the war, has to be the one to make sure it can be fought. So to him, when he heard the general call for an additional 1 million men, he probably began to have a small aneurysm. Not thinking about the lines being broken, but instead thinking about all the extra wages, rifles, tents, food, and supplies an extra 1 million untrained 18-year-olds showing up would consume on a daily basis. So instead, he tells you to ignore what Gerasimov has just told you, and instead put the extra money into the armaments industry. Build more tanks, build better tanks. That's what wins you the war. But before he can actually finish that thought, your next advisor chimes in. This time, it's Volodin, who's one of Putin's political advisors, giving the president an idea of the political temperature in Russia. Now, he too probably would have stroked out of the thought of having 1 million extra soldiers drafted into the Russian military, and would probably be pretty quick to remind Putin that 1 million extra men heading to the front means 1 million extra families who could possibly turn against the government, and that by conscripting this many men, it is a somewhat politically risky move. But being Volodin, he'd probably chime in with the positive outcome as well, stating that by putting 1 million extra men in the field, that'll actually get our unemployment rate down. And we could pump those men full of propaganda whilst they're there, so they have less chance of turning against us in rebellion. Plus, we can make some TV ads on how we're getting the youths off the street. So he gives you some pros and some cons, but in the end, doesn't really help your decision making here. The final person you turn to is Selyanov, the Minister of Finance, who in the most droning manner possible is probably telling you that 1 million extra fighting age men being stripped from the economy and pushed into the frontline service is going to have massive impacts on the wider Russian economy. He's probably going to tell you that with 1 million men being pulled out of the workforce, it's not only going to drive up wage costs for the military, it's not only going to cause massive labor shortages in most of the other sectors of Russian society, it's not only going to lower productivity overall, and thereby driving up inflation and consumer prices, but could also probably begin to list a whole bunch of detrimental economic factors that would come from conscripting this many additional men into the Russian military. But in the end, Selyanov probably tells you that because Russia isn't at an existential crisis, it's probably best to keep the military as small as possible, and instead focus on keeping a longer-term war economy going. After all, he's in charge of finance, and he's pretty unlikely to get blamed for the outcome of the war in Ukraine. You have 4 advisors with 4 opinions, and 4 wildly different policy solutions. And what should have been an easy decision, let's put more soldiers in the field to fight Ukraine, actually ends up being a really complicated one as soon as you look past it being just a purely defense issue. After all, if we just listened to Gerasimov, we wouldn't have found out about everything else. And this is the major consideration that comes with conscription. Because it isn't a program that just affects defense, it's a program that affects every part of the nation's economy, altering everything from unemployment to the strength of the currency. So why do countries adopt conscription? Who benefits and loses from it? And with major political parties in countries like Germany and the UK now proposing its reintroduction, what will conscription look like going forward? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to take us through the fundamentals of conscription and what drives the decision-making around it, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1: Enemies and Economics.
So if we think about Sweden, Finland, Singapore, similarly, Taiwan, they have overwhelming threats. And so conscription becomes a way of generating substantial mass against often a larger and more threatening adversary that would preclude their ability to generate genuine income as a nation, their GDP, if they were to mobilize the number of people in an all-volunteer force that they might need to stand up to that threat. So it becomes a very sensible policy choice.
Paul O'Neill is a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, whose research specializes in national security strategy, NATO, and the organizational aspects of defense and security, including organizational design and human resources within the armed forces. Previously, Paul was also a Royal Air Force officer working in strategy and human resources across the UK Ministry of Defence. So we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Most of the high-income countries that don't have that adjacent imminent threat have not gone down the conscription model, or indeed got rid of it in order to go for an all-volunteer force, because as militaries become more technologically sophisticated and they think about different ways of fighting that don't involve large numbers of relatively untrained individuals going and fighting, then it makes less sense to pursue a conscription model.
In the last few months in particular, we started to see a sort of resurgence in the calls to reintroduce conscription in particularly parts of Europe, most of this being a response to the war in Ukraine, with a number of the commanders of these European militaries claiming they can no longer ignore the long-standing manpower issues existing within their forces, and that throughout a lot of these European militaries, they are continuously falling short of their recruitment goals, with several of these NATO countries, including Latvia, Lithuania, and Sweden, having already reinstated conscription, whilst having Germany and the United Kingdom having major political parties put it forward as a key policy. Now, if we were to see more of these NATO countries go down that particular route and muster the additional 400,000 soldiers that some of these commanders have suggested, what impact do you think that would have on the overall defense situation in Europe?
I remain unconvinced of the military utility of a 400,000 conscript army or any major size conscript army. Even if you were to look at the relative size of the all-volunteer force of NATO versus Russia, then NATO substantially dwarfs the size of the Russian armed forces. So throwing hundreds of thousands of conscripts who will be by definition less well trained and therefore less well able to defend themselves, let alone less well able to prosecute opportunities in large-scale formations, just doesn't seem to me like a path we want to go down. And the West's advantage has always been the technology. And so we have offset the need for mass with improved technology. Precision, for example, as one of the offset strategies in the US, was one of those designed to offset Soviet mass in favor of Western technological advantage, because if you can use one missile to hit one target, you don't need to have 10 missiles for the same target. Whereas Russia's less technologically advanced approach has demanded the mass, both in people and in equipment, that NATO has been able to avoid.
So obviously we'll go through the military side of this a bit more later on in the episode. But for now, let's talk about some of the pros of conscription and why there are so many politicians bringing it up as a potential solution to some of their political problems. Now, why this is so important and why it's coming up now is that as I write this, Europe is somewhat in the midst of an unemployment crisis, particularly when it comes to youth unemployment, with NATO members Portugal, Spain, Luxembourg, Italy, Slovakia, Lithuania, Estonia, Sweden, Albania, and Greece all having youth unemployment rates of above 20%, which for context, the US's youth unemployment rate hit a high of 19.5 during some of the worst fallout of the '08 recession, and all these countries are currently above that rate. So when someone points to this huge pool of unemployed young civilians and says, well, why don't we put them to work in the armed forces and get that unemployment rate down? Is it actually the silver bullet for the economy that some of these politicians have proposed it to be?
Well, there are some economic models that say that those who are lower down on the OECD scale find that conscription is a way of providing employment where employment may not easily be found within the genuinely commercial or private sector, and it has a positive impact on GDP. The studies also find that those in higher OECD countries tend to find conscription suppresses economic activity. So it very much depends on what state the country is in, the level of the threat, the need to create societal stability, and also the question about does it boost economic activity or otherwise. And conscription is quite a neat way in many cases of trying to boost that economic activity.
Now, there's also countries who talked about specialized conscription, which would be looking to bring in specialized people or specialized trades in order to try and plug holes in their current force structure. And we'll use Australia as a bit of an example here. Now, Australia, much like the UK, runs a military model of having a very small force, but one that is pretty well armed per capita. And for Australia, this model will probably work perfectly fine unless New Zealand ends up discovering modern technology. But where the Australian Army really does struggle at the moment is in getting their trades roles filled. Was that whilst the Australian Army has plenty of gunners and tank drivers and snipers, what they're severely lacking at the moment are electricians, diesel mechanics and welders, the kind of guys that actually keep the army going. And it's actually pretty easy to see why they are lacking these roles. As whilst an electrician working with the Australian Army will be not only possibly deployed overseas, have to do a whole bunch of rigorous training, and will likely be under security restrictions for quite a long time, under current Australian payment structures, they're only likely to be paid the equivalent of about $50,000. Whereas any semi-decent electrician working at one of the bigger mine sites in the north of the country could easily earn around $130,000, earning that money in arguably a much cleaner and easier environment as well. So the private mining companies end up hoovering up all the electricians and other tradespeople that the army frankly desperately needs at the moment. Now, this sort of private poaching that happens across a whole bunch of industries, what impact do you think it has on the armed forces?
If you're then bringing people in who don't have the skills that you want, you have to accept that you're going to pay to develop them, and then you make them highly marketable and attractive to the outside employment market. If you try to bring in people who are attractive, then that becomes much more difficult because it then has the knock-on economic effect.
Well, sticking for Australia for a bit, Australia hasn't had the draft of the National Service since 1972, with Australia, as well as a whole bunch of other countries, moving toward an all-volunteer force since that period, with very, very few of them ever going back to conscription once they've left that. Now, technology may be one reason for it, but another key factor seems to be the massive expense of reintroducing conscription. As it appears, after having abolished it, conscription is far, far, far more expensive to actually put back in place. So why is that?
In large part, I think it's because armed forces, and forgive me for focusing particularly on the Western armed forces at this moment, have tended to, in inverted commas, optimize for the small all-volunteer force. And so there's been a consistent approach, certainly in the UK and elsewhere, to reduce the book value of their assets, selling off estates, reducing their housing stock or single accommodation stock, reducing holdings of weapons, uniforms, and so on. So if you now suddenly increase significantly the numbers of people going through your systems who need accommodation, who need training and so on, you've got to reintroduce the infrastructure. You've got to regrow the people who can be spared to do that training. And in the UK, it's become very taut. In one of the papers I worked on last year, even to train a relatively small number of Ukrainian engineers required the British Army to stop training some of its own engineers. And we're talking just about 2 handfuls of Ukrainian engineers required stopping of British military courses to divert the instructors, the schoolrooms, and so on to this. If you now start talking about that in the thousands, then it becomes enormously problematic from a logistics perspective. And so you have to reinvest in building the capacity to absorb the through flow that conscription brings in.
So for now, let's leave Australia and let's go back to the US for a moment. Now, the US made the transition to an all-volunteer force back in 1973, mostly as pushback for the war in Vietnam. And back then for the draft, the US used to use the lottery system, making it supposedly random on who gets drafted. All you had to do is meet the fitness requirements. But today, those fitness requirements actually might be quite problematic on who you can draft and who you can't draft. And for what I'm talking about here, let's look at some precursory stats. Now, if we go back to 1973, less than 10% of the US population had military exclusionary allergies such as peanuts or shellfish. Whereas today, that number is up to about 30% for adults and actually up to about 40% for children. And when on top of that, you then add the obesity rate in the United States, things get even more complicated. As whilst in 1973, the obesity rate in the US was about 15% of the population, today it now sits at about 42% of all adults. Now, between these two, that is surely going to eat into the amount of people the military could draft if the US even wanted to go down the road of conscription, yes?
One of the challenges the Americans face is in lifestyle. And of course, armed forces typically have quite tight constraints on who is eligible for fitness purposes to join. And it's one of the big reasons why, particularly the American armed forces, reject people on application for an all-volunteer force. It's the lifestyle element makes it difficult, fitness and so on. So you'd have to think about what your standards were for recruitment, because if you're only keeping people for a short period of time, you don't need to worry about their health and how that might manifest over 10 years, for example. But you'd have to change your policies, and that has a cost associated with it, because you have to train the people who are doing the recruiting and you'd have to train the people who are doing the training to understand those new rules. I think in the American system, it would depend on the scale of the conscription. That if you went for a selective model like Sweden, there probably wouldn't be as much of a burden on their existing infrastructure as going for full national conscription. And similarly, the case in the UK, that if you went for a small selective conscription, such as that advocated by the Conservative Party in the last election campaign, then those weren't huge numbers. They weren't militarily significant either. So it does make me question why they took that approach. But you would have to invest in the infrastructure of your bases. You might have to invest in infrastructure of your recruiting locations as well, because if you're bringing more people in, you might have to go to where the people are rather than demand that they come to you if they're no longer volunteers. You would need, obviously, uniforms. You would need personal items of equipment. You would need to expand your training pipeline capacity, including the number of instructors. You'd probably have to expand the number of logisticians because you're dealing with more stuff to issue and return. You would have to increase your business support staffs. So there's a huge knock-on effect if your armed force has been optimized for a certain scale of personnel and you're now substantially increasing those numbers of people in order for them to be coped with. It very much depends on what you want to do.
Now, one of the bigger arguments you'll see about conscription is about who actually gets called up for service. As on one side, you'll see people suggest that conscription should be universal, a good cross-section of society. That way different groups intermingle more, there's more diversity of thought, and it doesn't end up being just the rich making the poor people go off to fight. And on the other hand, there's governments being more selective about who they want to draft into the military, effectively the model the Russians use. Now, with the Russian model, conscripts were required to serve a minimum of 12 months, with all men between the ages of 18 and 30 being eligible for drafting, with Russia conducting 2 annual draft cycles, typically in spring, sometime between April and July, and fall sometime between October and December. Now, the Russians do have a lot of exceptions to the rules on who can be drafted, where much like the Americans, draftees can use health, higher education, or family issues to either preclude themselves from the draft or defer their time in service. But who gets picked overall actually comes down to a lottery that's decided by the local draft boards, with each region having a local draft board. And this is where the Kremlin can start to get involved, as the Kremlin can then lean on some of these local draft boards without having to do the dirty work themselves. And if we look at Russia's recent round of drafts as an example, the Russian republics, krais and oblasts like Buryatia, Dagestan, Tver, and Krasnoyarsk seeing much higher rates of drafting than the rest of the country. In fact, Krasnoyarsk, which is in the middle of Siberia, in the last period saw 5.5% of its available reserves being mobilized for the war, whilst the richer areas of the country, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg, have seen less than 1% of their available reserves drafted to the war. Now, whilst on one side of the argument people will say this is classist and unfair, An economist might say, well, Russia is simply targeting Russian citizens whose economic productivities are lower than the average, therefore producing less of an impact on the overall Russian economy. Now, between those two arguments, where would you sit?
If you want to create militarily effective forces, then you would take a very different approach to this, to one where you're turning around and saying, actually, what I want is just relatively cheap mass to be able to throw at a problem. And we know Russia's approach to the value of human life. So for them, that model is an understandable model. It's probably not a model that most Western societies would tolerate, where you just hoover in vast numbers of people and regard them as expendable on the battlefield. The lottery model, again, it depends on how you run the lottery. If you were to focus the lottery on those with, for example, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics skills, things that could be useful at higher levels of competence, then that makes sense, but you have to accept that you're then denuding your commercial sector from those individuals. And those would be the people highly attractive to many of your income-generating businesses. So you'd have to manage that trade-off, which is why I think there is no single model for conscription that could be universal. It might be applied differently in different countries, depending on their economic status, the status of threats, the demand for societal cohesion.
So one of the other big arguments around conscription is about the cost of doing the program itself. As when you're a military, you really only have a very set budget to work with. As for most countries, the military's budget is preset by the legislative branch. So if you're, for example, the United Kingdom, well, by having that much smaller manpower footprint, as they're one of those armies that has a small amount of people, but those people are very well armed, it allows much more room in the budget to put towards procurement, research and development. And because they're not paying out so much in wages, right now the UK is able to spend around 39% of its military budget on procurement and R&D. Whereas if we look at the flip side of this and take a country like Uzbekistan, who operates a very large, very manpower-heavy military, meaning that the majority of the nation's defense spending actually mostly goes towards wages and upkeep, what we find is that the Uzbek military is only usually able to spend around 3 to 5% of its entire military budget towards buying new weapons, tanks, or research, which goes a long way to explaining why they're still operating mostly pre-independent Soviet equipment. So there's always going to be a balance between how many troops you want and how much you're willing to pay in wages versus how much equipment and research you can buy and put into the battlefield. Now, obviously, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different countries throughout this episode, but to harp back on the UK and use that as a bit of an example, if let's say the United Kingdom decided to swing wildly in the other direction, and an incoming UK government decides to scrap Trident, their nuclear deterrent, and spend the £2.4 billion it takes to upkeep that system, and instead spend their money to hire, train, and accommodate an additional 45,000 conscripts for the UK Army, effectively increasing the Army's total size by 56%. But going down that road, do you think the loss of deterrence is adequately made up by the reduction in unemployment and the addition of 45,000 soldiers to the UK ranks?
I can't see how pure, relatively less capable mass would provide the same kind of level of deterrence. I think as well, the idea that it's about getting people off the streets and giving them skills, that doesn't make it a military problem. That's an education problem. That's an employment problem. And you would be better off, in my mind, finding meaningful employment opportunities for people in income-generating roles, not roles that have to be paid for by the general taxation of those who are generating wealth for the country.
So why do so many countries adopt the conscription model then?
One is intended to be a deterrent effect. So the idea would be you would have enough intelligence to provide the indicators and warnings to start mobilizing your citizenry to counter the threat. And in doing so, that acts as a deterrent to prevent it happening.
And that makes some sense. If you're South Korea, Finland, or Taiwan, you want to try and make your country seem as difficult to invade as possible. So your much larger enemy who may want to invade you may decide that it really just isn't worth it. But if we're looking at Taiwan as our example here, conscription does raise another question though, as whilst most studies would suggest that the Battle of Taiwan will be won or lost in the first 3 to 4 weeks, most Taiwanese defense planners also acknowledge it would take around 4 to 6 weeks to get all of their reserves reassembled, armed, outfitted, and ready for battle. So how would Taiwan plan to get around this issue?
My personal view is I think you're right. I'm not convinced by the arguments for conscription at a military level, because the needs of militaries for technologically savvy, well-trained, able to operate in large formation personnel means that it's very difficult to grow that quickly. And conscription typically is somewhere between a year and 2 years. And in certainly the more sophisticated elements of the armed forces, you're not even getting people ready to be at initial operating capability, ready to be employed in the core of their trade within that period of time. So I do think conscription is a very expensive way of generating not very capable armed forces. We have seen in Ukraine, for example, if you are a civilian drone operator, you can probably operate an FPV, a first-person vision drone. So there are ways in which conscription could add value, but I would argue you'd be better off doing that through a more formalized reserve model than you would through conscription, where you force large chunks of your eligible population into compulsory military service. Because there are discussions about the negative economic impacts of doing so, and the fact you delay people getting into the talent pool.
In which case, if I were to, let's say, make you the president of Finland, which very much ticks a lot of the boxes that people would need for conscription, what would you do differently? Would you keep conscription or would you get rid of it?
I would certainly be looking at a transition. So I wouldn't get rid of conscription tomorrow because there aren't the weapon systems you could bring in tomorrow that would compensate for it. But I would be questioning whether this is something that is advantageous for the nation to maintain, particularly in the context of Finland. Now it's joined NATO. I think for a lot of countries that don't have conscription, there's probably a good reason why they don't have conscription. If I wanted to create a sense of loyalty to the state, a sense of shared endeavour, and that was more important to me than economic growth, then I would think conscription made sense. I think there'd be a question in my mind as to whether that was a military solution or whether that was a more societal one. You remember Jacques Chirac had this idea after riots in France that he wanted to create a kind of citizenship service. David Cameron spoke about the big society back in 2010 as a way of building loyalty. And there may well be ways societies can build in a model of public service that doesn't have to involve the military. I think if I were facing a military threat, and that was the only reason for doing it, then I would be questioning whether that was the most viable solution. But how quickly I could grow credible military capability that would deter the threat I'm most worried about by using more professional forces combined with technology. Because conscription would appear to undermine the economic generating capacity of nations.
So amongst most conventional economists, conscription is understood to drain about 1 to 2% of a country's GDP, with this occurring because of quite a number of factors, such as the people you take out of the labour pool, the people who are placed into the armed forces and steered away from the ideal vocation, as well as the overall money the state has to pay to keep these conscripts going. But yet, if you're willing to accept that conscription is a pretty good deterrent, and frankly an insurance policy, then all of this may seem very, very worth it. After all, losing 1 to 2% of your GDP is still better than being overrun by your larger neighbour. And a country who very much understands this problem, and also very much views conscription as a worthwhile endeavour, is one sitting right on Russia's doorstep. That country being Finland, one of the most interesting test cases when it comes to conscription. So let's take a deeper look at Finland, find out how popular conscription is there, how these soldiers get called up, and how ready they are for war. And to answer all that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. A forced force.
The first month of service is taken up by general conscript training basic skills, and then after that you get assigned to a more specific training, whether it's being an NCO or if you're an anti-air gun person or whatever your role is. But everyone has a shared basic training like boot camp.
Private Gona, whose real name will be omitting from this recording for security reasons, is a private in the Finnish military who's just been through the conscription process, having been drafted just recently, and whilst speaking to us under a pseudonym, will be able to give us first-hand insight into not only the Finnish conscription process, but also how the process is seen throughout the country and what Finnish conscripts are trained to do. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
As far as I understand it, you get some skills from military service, such as, for example, if you're a driver in logistics, then that will help you with, for example, getting a job from some logistics company.
So conscription around the world can vary quite a lot in length, with countries like Georgia being as short as 6 months, whilst countries like North Korea have conscription lasting for 10 years for men or 7 years for women. But can you take us through how long the conscription period is in Finland?
Yeah, for example, a medical person, they will serve 9 months. In contrast, an NCO will serve 12 months, and some more menial roles, like a cook, might serve just 6 months.
Now, particularly in the former Soviet-style militaries, the Armed Forces Command typically deploys its conscripts on the opposite side of the country to where they're conscripted from. So in other words, if you live in the north of somewhere like Tajikistan, your conscription deployment is typically going to be carried out in the south or east of the country. This way the conscripts won't be able to run away as easily, and they have less chance of being able to utilize pre-acquired networks to more efficiently steal Tajik military equipment. Now, is that a process that also takes place in Finland's conscripts? Or are the Finnish given a little more trust and freedom in where they're deployed?
When you show up to the call-up, when you get information about your conscription, you also get to place wish upon which garrison you might want to go to. At the same time, the army will have a great say over where you end up. If, for example, the barrack you want to go to is full, the army will most likely assign you to some other barrack. As far as I'm aware, it is generally that preferably they will be from nearer to the barracks. In my own experience from my barrack, a lot of the people there were from the nearby region.
Now, obviously Finland is a wealthy nation per capita, so you would expect them to have a much more technically advanced set of weapon systems. But the trouble is that a lot of today's more advanced systems and platforms actually take a fair while to get your head around, and are also far too expensive to just let any old conscript fire some of them off. So conscripts, even in wealthy countries like Finland, often end up training with fairly basic equipment compared to something like the US, UK or Australian army soldiers. But with the equipment you trained with, what sort of training are they carrying out with it? Are you mostly practicing with shovels and rifles, preparing defensive measures? Or are you guys drilling for Finland's eventual recapture of St. Petersburg? What sort of training is the Finnish conscript given?
In the basic training, you get taught how to use a gun, how to maintain the gun, in regards to more tactical stuff. The biggest thing you get taught is how to advance in a squad of 3 people, also shooting range exercise. Additionally, you get trained in holding a defensive position and figuring out a good defensive position, as well as how to dig down mines. However, it is more defensive oriented, at least for the basic training part, with some training for basic advancing forward in a squad in a forest, in my garrison's case at least.
Now, the way many conscription militaries work is that they have a cadres and conscript system. So let's take a moment and really unpack how that works. Now in Finland, the government claims it could mobilize as many as 280,000 soldiers in the event of a war, which, if correct, would give them a bigger armed force than France or Saudi Arabia, from a population of under 5.6 million people, which is pretty impressive. But that big number there, that 280,000, not only includes the military, but also includes effectively anyone that could be called upon in the event of war, with around 18,000 of these reservists doing refresher courses each year. But if we zoom in on that big number of 280,000, we then arrive at the active armed forces. Now, these are the people who are actively serving in the Finnish military, and this number is much smaller than that 280,000. In fact, there's only about 8,000 professional soldiers and about 16,000 conscripts across the army, navy, and air forces. Meaning that for every 1 professional in the Finnish army, there are about 2 conscripts. Now, under this system, the professionals, or the cadres, will make up the core of the force, being tasked with training and leading some of the conscripts, and also being prepared to lead a much larger force if mobilization were ever called. Because as things stand, of that 280,000 they could supposedly mobilize, only about 2% of that number are actually fully professional, full-time Finnish soldiers. Now, obviously through your deployment, you would have met with not only officers, but cadres and conscripts as well. So how would you compare the demeanors and attitudes of, let's say, the cadres as compared to the conscripts?
As for the conscripts, they're usually just common people doing their service. Their motivation to serve will vary a lot more because they're there just to do their basic duty, and how enthusiastic they are about it does depend on the person. In contrast, the more permanent people, they are more professional.
Now, payments is always going to be a bit of a sore spot for any conscript, as whilst the average wage in Finland is around 1,000 USD a week, most conscripts are actually only paid the equivalent of about 40 to 105 USD a week, which on the low end is only about 4% of the average Finnish wage. In fact, these wages are so low that the International Labour Organization would probably class this as slavery. But here's the thing. Governments can't actually really afford to pay much more than that without doing significant damage to other parts of the economy. And since Finland technically has no minimum wage, let's look at another example for this one. Because here's the thing, if we take a look at a country like South Korea, whose wages are only a bit below those of Finland, their conscripts are also paid well below the minimum wage. But if the military was to try and amend that, and pay these South Korean conscripts even just the bare minimum wage in South Korea, the armed forces budget would have to increase by 800% just to meet that demand, roughly making it around 21.7% of the entire country's GDP. All of which is before inflation starts kicking in and soldiers start demanding higher than minimum wage. In other words, maintaining such a large force is quite an expensive endeavor to pull off. And I'm sure it's very different when you're living through it, but how can a person live off 4% of a Finnish wage? Does the government provide support in some other way to try and help with that?
It is quite a token payment, and it's on its own is definitely not enough if you're living on your own. However, the government subsidizes if you're in military service. For example, if you are living on your own, in that case, your rent will be handled through the National Welfare Service, Kela.
Now, while most conscripts are paid exactly the same, some get a little extra pay for danger pay, and some get extra pay for specialized skills. However, as an oddity of the Finnish military, all women are also paid a bonus as well. That bonus being paid as women, unlike the men, in the Finnish military are expected to buy their own underwear. Because as much as the Finnish military can work out how to put a missile onto a 1 by 1 meter square halfway across the country, they apparently don't trust themselves enough to work out the difference between an underwire and a sports bra, and instead leave it to the female recruits to sort themselves. Now, women being drafted into the military is a pretty contentious issue in different parts of the world, with Finland making the decision to open up its military to women on a purely voluntary basis just as recently as 1995. However, as much as it is now open to both sexes, the percentage of women taking that opportunity up is still quite low, with female representation in the military fluctuating somewhere between 2 and 7%, depending on what branches of the military you want to include under that bracket. With yourself having served alongside women who went through training with you, do you feel they're treated any differently training-wise?
Women are generally integrated. They do have their own rooms, of course, but towards the end of my service, I was sharing a bunk room with women as well. So they're pretty integrated. They go through the same basic training as well.
Now, once you're done with your conscription stint, you then get to go home and rejoin wider society as part of the reserves. Now, for some countries like Taiwan or Switzerland, well, they often call their reserves back to do refresher courses, update some of their training, or just generally check in. In other countries though, particularly countries like Tajikistan, where the country has an absurdly high reserve rate, being mobilized, for lack of a better word, can mean simply just texting your reporting officer that, yes, you are somewhere in the country at the moment, with the officer making no efforts to verify if that's true or not. Now, a nation like Tajikistan is pretty likely to pursue an option like this for mobilization drills, as frankly, they probably don't have enough uniforms or rifles lying around if everyone actually did show up. But what is the situation like with the Finnish reserves? What are you expected to do once you've completed all your training and headed back home?
So when you finish your conscription, you're basically put into the reserve. And for the most part, you have very little obligations unless you decide to stay with the military. However, there is the duty that if you get called up for rehearsal training, like going back to rehearse skills, then you will have to go, and the state will once again cover for like travel expenses in that. But the main duty during reserve is to go to rehearsal training if you are called up for that. But besides that, there's little duties. Besides, of course, if war happens, then you get called up to serve.
One of the other oddities about Finland is just how supportive the majority of the population is toward conscription. In fact, the numbers I have in front of me would suggest that support for the practice is somewhere in the ballpark of 81%, which is a stark contrast to how the majority of the world feels about conscription. With Russia sitting at a 59% approval, the United States at a 44% approval, France at a 29% approval, Germany at an 18% approval, and the UK at a 10% approval. Shocking absolutely no one except Rishi Sunak's political advisors. But circling back to that 81% figure, how real do you think those numbers are in Finland? Is there really that much genuine support for the practice?
I would say it is roughly correct in that there is more support. The service is such an integral part of Finnish males' life experience as it is. So it's just seen as the norm. Obviously, there is some discourse over, for example, how fair is it that men have to serve. That is a matter that is the biggest point of contention as far as I see. I would say there is definitely more support for the military after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the calls for voluntary service has definitely died down.
Well, having now been through all of it, how would you feel if the government abolished it? What would be your reaction if the government woke up tomorrow and decided it no longer wanted to do conscription?
In my own case, I would probably feel a little indifferent. At the same time, I might feel a little jealous that the younger generations wouldn't have to do it mandatorily like I did. And I am certain that many boys about to graduate high school would also be happy about it. At the same time, the people who have completed their service would probably feel a little annoyed about the fact that they had to do it, but those after them don't have to do it. That is roughly what I feel would be the reaction to it. Though at the same time, in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would think a lot of people would also think that what the hell is this government doing ending conscription so suddenly if it were to somehow happen.
See, Finland is a pretty good example of hard power reasoning to engage in conscription. I mean, Russia is right there. But what about when conscription is driven by soft power? Why would a state pursue conscription if, like Austria, Singapore, or Uzbekistan, they haven't got any major powers ready to barrel down upon them at short notice? If the entire point of conscription is to make you unattractive to be invaded, simply to hold the defensive lines long enough that your allies show up, well, what do those countries gain from the practice? Why would they continue to pursue conscription when they know it probably costs their GDP 1 to 2%? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. Distortions and Detachments.
If the president has decided that they want to have large-scale mobilization with large proportions of those who are of general age of eligibility for service, the cost of getting people into the army is borne by someone. So whether that's borne through the general tax base, where you tax the economy more to be able to afford to pay more to your service people, or whether you implicitly tax people who you conscript into service by saying you must come in and serve for a pay rate that we're going to be deciding on, and you have little choice about it. You must come in and serve. You're then implicitly bearing that tax.
Eric Crampton is the chief economist at the New Zealand Initiative and an adjunct senior fellow at the Department of Economics and Finance at the University of Canterbury, with a specialised background in national economic policy and governmental responses to everything from conscription to earthquake preparedness. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
If you're in places that are facing very real threats and that need substantial mobilization, the case for conscription is stronger than it otherwise would be, and particularly for conscription for training, so that you're ready to be called up in case of emergency if invasion is imminent. And invasion has always seemed kind of imminent in South Korea. So it's a stronger case there than in other places. If you were looking at it in the United States, though, it does not seem likely that large-scale mobilization is on the horizon.
So depending on what sort of economist you speak with and how you look at this topic, some will view conscription as a purely military affair, whilst others will view it as simply just another form of tax, with people paying time rather than money. So what considerations are actually in place when a government makes a decision on whether to or to not adopt conscription for their country?
In some ways, the decision around conscription is really an optimal tax question, which is kind of fun for an economist. Is it better to put that burden on those who are of age eligible for service? Or is it better to put that burden onto the tax base more broadly? And you can make arguments on either side of that depending on the scale of the mobilization. So what do I mean by that? If the president had decided tomorrow that they wanted 10% of the population that's eligible for service, well, that's something that could be reasonably accommodated by increasing pay, better conditions in the military, increased retirement benefits, all kinds of things that they could do to make military service more attractive, with the cost then falling on the general tax base.
So let's take a moment and talk about market distortions, as it effectively shows us how conscription impacts all of the wider markets. As with any decision when it comes to economics, when you make a decision here, well, it makes an impact here. Now, as an example of one of these distortions, elephant in the room, with conscription being a predominantly male-focused program, it's obviously going to give a disadvantage to the men than it would to the women. And whilst most countries may not even put women in their armed forces, even in more westernized nations like Finland, the ratio of men to women that are conscripted into the army is very noticeably different. As whilst Finland has opened up military service to women as of 1995, women only join military service on a purely voluntary basis, where out of the 36,900 conscripts taken into the Finnish military during that period, only a little over 600 of those were women, equating to about roughly 1.7% of the overall intake. Now, with conscription being a usually male-only practice, it obviously takes males out of the skills acquisition and jobs market for quite a number of years, depending on the country. And sometimes employers are more hesitant to employ males if they think a male employee may be called away for national service, with countries like South Korea often making male applicants mark if they have or have not completed their national service before getting the job. However, one could also argue that this simply just evens up the odds, as working women often have to take a similar amount of time out of the workforce to have children. However, on a completely different front, there are others out there who would argue that by disadvantaging all men and women who have children, the system somewhat incentivizes women to work and not have children. However, the overall impact is still pretty hard to quantify here. But even if we put aside all of these individual distortions, there is a whole bunch of industry-to-industry distortions as well. You see, in a country like Uzbekistan, as an example, they take up a lot of conscripts each year. However, a huge chunk of those conscripts they bring up, until very, very recently, were actually used mostly to pick cotton in the Uzbek cotton fields, or repair infrastructure around the country. And what this meant is that the government cotton companies could absolutely undercut all of the private sellers. Because after all, access to free labor is better than access to cheap labor. And whilst this brought down the price of cotton and gave the government a near monopoly on the cotton market, the impacts of this also rippled out into a whole bunch of other industries as well, with the government conscripting so many men into the cotton fields. Now, in all the other industries, there was a shortage of working men. And when there's a shortage of labor, well, the price of wages goes up. So employers in almost every other industry ended up having to pay their employees more. In economics, it's actually quite common that when you implement such large, all-encompassing programs, there are almost always bound to be massive distortions across a whole bunch of industries right away. But what are some of the other upsides and downsides that we maybe haven't talked about yet?
In a lot of areas, economists just point to the trade-offs. Both outcomes are pretty bad. You have to figure out which one is going to be the least bad in any particular circumstance, because they both have downsides. When you're also looking at conscription, I'm Canadian, and a lot of my university professors were people who had been subject to the draft in Vietnam, but decided to move north instead. That's one distortion that you can get with conscription. Talked about other distortions that you can get with taxes that are trying to raise pay rates to get people voluntarily into the army. So if the government had decided that they want to have vast increases of the number of people in service, well, that would obviously be bidding labor away from other uses. It might be more difficult to try and fill skill gaps in the private sector because key people might get pulled away in areas that you weren't expecting and then put into roles in the military where they might not be able to make best use of the skills that they'd had in the private sector. With a volunteer army, the people who are first pulled in are those who have the lowest opportunity cost in the private sector or would be the best fit for the military if they're trying to specifically recruit in specific areas. That would be less disruptive for private industry and for the private sector, have less harm for other businesses.
So I want to just go back to those state companies for a minute. Now, one of the trends you do see when looking at the countries that do this is that conscription is actually quite common within military dictatorships, and it's pretty easy to see why. As not only do you give a bunch of jobs to a portion of your citizens who are the most likely to join a mob and overthrow you, and then once they're in the armed services, you can blast them with propaganda for a while, and it'll allow you to slash your unemployment as soon as you come into power. But with such a large amount of personnel churning through the system, it gets pretty easy to fudge the numbers of conscripts you actually have. So to your enemies, you can seem much more powerful than you really are. And to some of your generals, well, they can add an extra 100 or 200 soldiers to their ranks, tell the government they took on 300, and simply pocket the extra 100 paychecks themselves. And if those generals happen to own any factories, well, those conscripts could be used to either work in those factories as cheap labor, or build infrastructure that makes it cheaper and easier for those factories to get their products to market, pretty quickly giving that general's factory an advantage that no other factory has. And when coupled up with all of the government contracts he's likely to get, it's pretty easy to see how some of these general-affiliated or regime-affiliated companies can quickly dominate their industries. And we can see this model being used in a whole bunch of different countries around the world, with governments like Egypt, Indonesia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Myanmar all using some variation of this playbook. Now, for the citizens, well, they arguably get access to cheaper manufactured goods that are made right there in the country. And for the generals, well, they can take in extra pay and now probably don't have to go looking abroad for the bribe money they're seeking. And for the leader, well, he gets to award lucrative cheap labor contracts to the generals and industries he deems useful or necessary to keep his administration alive. But on top of those, what are some of the other advantages of using conscripted labor?
Anything is cheaper for the state if it forces people to do it rather than paying them to do it voluntarily. I don't think that you would want to have a spot where, for example, the government would be conscripting people to work in the hospitals rather than paying doctors a salary that's sufficient to get them to be willing to work. I don't think it would be a better idea to run the public service on that basis either, where people could be randomly sucked into work into the bureaus at very low pay, but under compulsion that they'd be sent to prison if they failed to show up for work. You get all kinds of difficulties on both sides. You have workers who might not be good fits for the roles that they're in and with little incentive to try to do a good job in it. Normally, if you've got people voluntarily employed in the sector, they will be trying to get promoted. They will want to have good references to be able to use in later employment. Incentives are aligned for them to be trying to do a good job. If you have them there by compulsion, someone who's conscripted into the army might not be trying to rise through the ranks to higher ranks. They just want to see through the end of their period without being killed. And at the end of that, not come back. So that's a very different kind of set of incentives. It sounds a pretty awful way of running industry, though. Firms that have access to compelled labor will be making different choices about automation and capital augmentation, like getting machines in to take the place of workers in tasks that are better done with additional machines. If you're getting a whole pile of workers for free, maybe it's better to give each of them a shovel rather than to finally buy a bulldozer, even if the bulldozer would be more efficient in a global sense. You want to avoid those kinds of situations. Compelled labor can get you into those kinds of situations, so it certainly wouldn't be recommended.
And we actually have seen that exact problem playing out before, with many of the Uzbek cotton farmers refusing to purchase modern tractors and equipment until the government began phasing out its practice of using conscripts for cotton picking. So if we're not going to adopt one of these massive systems, what about a scaled down version of it? Or a system that, let's say, only conscripts enough soldiers simply to fill the gap that might have occurred during the recruitment phase?
I don't think either of those is particularly good. The practice that you've mentioned on conscripting primarily from the ranks of poor, well, that was also the case in the United States. Well, I'm not sure if it'd be inadvertent, but if you have exemptions from the draft for example, being in tertiary education, that will automatically mean that the draft is skewed towards lower income cohorts rather than those who are more able to get into university.
So what kind of system would you advocate for then?
So again, my preference is an all-volunteer force where people are paid enough to be willing to enter into service on a willing buyer, willing seller kind of arrangement, and everyone else who is benefited by the existence of a military, who is protecting you against foreign threats and advancing your country's interests. People like me who are still at a desk, we're contributing to that through our taxes, and that's a more fair way of running things. If you're in a spot where you're using conscription, there's always going to be temptation to pay very little, as little as you can really get away with, because you're not having to attract workers in from other sectors. A minimum wage is one way of trying to address that, but it's still well below what would be necessary to draw people in. If you're in the spots where you would have to be paying an incredibly high wage to draw enough people in voluntarily because you're in a total war situation, then you will always be underpaying relative to that voluntary amount. And that's the less bad way of doing it. That you'd be paying more than a minimum wage, but you'd largely be financing out of debt and inflation. I find it easier to imagine compulsory training for military service coming back in Europe in particular, given the threat from Russia, than full-scale conscription, the abolition of conscription-based military in the US, and the return to an all-voluntary force. That case was largely based on work done by economists showing that the economics of conscription did not really stack up and that a volunteer force was more economically sensible. So folks like Walter Oy had worked on this. Milton Friedman served on the Gates Commission. He had an exchange with General Westmoreland favoring an all-volunteer force. The economists had done the work at that time showing that conscription didn't really make a lot of sense in America in the context of mobilization consistent with the Vietnam War. So Friedman did leave open the option for resorting to conscription in cases where you needed to mobilize far more soldiers, but given the work that they'd done then, you probably shouldn't be looking at it if your scale of mobilization is less than what they were looking at in Vietnam, because the case there was already shown to be pretty weak.
So, is conscription a good or a bad thing? Well, frankly, every rule you would prescribe a country to have conscription, well, there's another country that breaks it. Like that you should only use it if you're under imminent invasion threat, as conscription is an incredibly useful tool to rebuild a force very quickly, as we've seen in places like Ukraine, Israel, and Syria. So why is it then that Switzerland, Uzbekistan, and Thailand, with no real huge threat on their doorstep, use conscription? Okay, well then you should only do it if you have enough national income to afford the expected 1 to 2% of GDP loss that's associated with this program, which seems perfectly fine if you're Sweden, Austria, or Finland. So why then do some of the world's poorest countries, like South Sudan, Chad, and Benin, also use conscription? You should only use conscription in highly ethnically homogenous populations like Belarus, Venezuela, or Kazakhstan, as it helps build national spirit. So why then do Russia, Iran, Tajikistan, and Mongolia, all of which have large ethnic minorities operating within them, well, they all use conscription. And for those of you who are just a bit indecisive, well, why not try and have the best of both worlds? Why not try and have good tech and conscription, in the same way that Taiwan, Norway, or South Korea does? Well, because most economists would argue that those citizens could probably be put to better use elsewhere in the economy. And your defense analysts are probably going to argue that that higher tech that you've been calling for often has a much steeper learning curve and is often much more expensive to train with, meaning that by the time you taught your new conscripts to perfectly manage that new weapon system, well, congrats, they're out of the service already. So whether to adopt conscription or not is a pretty complicated question. Even looking at whether to keep it or not is also a pretty complicated question, as for someone like Finland, who on the one hand might think about abolishing the practice, as it could possibly open up a whole bunch of money for extra procurement, allow the government to sell off a whole bunch of the no longer required barracks and storage facilities, could also see a whole bunch of their citizens returning to the private sector, and therefore actually paying taxes. A quick policy reversal, and you can add 1 to 2% onto your GDP, which for any politician really does sound nice. But on the other hand, you also know that once it's gone, it's really hard to bring back. And if you start paying your soldiers a somewhat decent wage, well, there goes a lot of that procurement budget. And if you ever wanted to reintroduce the program, well, now you're going to have to buy those barracks back at probably 3 to 4 times the cost you sold them for. All of which is projected onto a background where Finland shares a very long border with Russia, and roughly only 2% of its entire reserves are full-time professional soldiers. So when it comes to conscription, there really is no yes or no right answer on this one. Conscription can be helpful and it can be harmful. If you're a policymaker though, what you need to decide is which parts of the markets, populations, manpower, education, gender equality, ethnicities, industries, and allegiance you do want to help, and which ones you're happy to hurt. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. This is one I've wanted to tackle for a while, as it's a question I've never really had a good answer to. So I'm glad we finally got around to it. And we were able to produce an episode with all this research and work to arrive at the answer of, well, it's complicated, bringing you a real classic red line ending. But if you want to find out what our next big subject will be, or any other info of events and everything else we have coming up, you can find all of our info and links on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me, I'm on Twitter on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, whose small donations each week help myself and the team keep this show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Tassie Takiel, Nix, Michael Johnson, Oxen, Melissa Miller, David Gebel, and a very special thanks to Anush Fard, who are the latest patrons to sign up as of the time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we really cannot thank them enough. So if you feel you could spare a couple of dollars and you want special access to things like our full video presentations, exploring topics like what the likely outcome of a 2024 renewal of the Russo-Georgian War would be, a full briefing of who is inside Putin's most inner circle, or a stream at who would likely join a Chinese-led security alliance, you can find all of the info and links for that on our Patreon link below. But for now, this episode on the economics of conscription is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are 3 book recommendations. The first is Defense Logistics, Enabling and Sustaining Successful Military Operations by Jeremy Smith, for a good look at some of the underlying factors that tend to drive Defense Department's decision-making. The second is Militarizing Men, Gender, Conscription, and War in Post-Soviet Russia by Maya Eichler, for a much more personal look at how Russia broaches the topic of conscription. And the third is Economic War by friend of the show, Maximilian Hess, for a closer look at the economic drivers of conflicts. I also want to thank this week's guests, Paul O'Neill, our Finnish friend, and Eric Crampton. It was great to have you on for this pretty niche topic. On top of them, I'd like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers of this piece, them being Ben Nutter, Gabriel Lane, Jack Schenkman, Jonah Gunn, Lawrence Van Kierbilk, Nate Ostella, and Sean Cotterlem. And on top of those guys, I'd like to thank the rest of the team as well, that being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Schenkman, the production manager, Daniela Chivella, Nate Ostella, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Dolan-May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz Van Kierbilk, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Scott Misler-Ferguson, and Sean Cotterlem, our research assistants and writers. Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vulgarten, our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. I know I say it almost every episode, but I'm incredibly appreciative of the team. But lastly, the Red Line will be back in a fortnight with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.